The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged hills surrounding Dry Creek, painting the sky in streaks of orange, purple, and blood red. Every shadow stretched long across the dusty main street, where the town's wooden buildings leaned into each other as if whispering secrets. The wind carried a fine grit that stung eyes and made every inhalation feel thick, but it also carried whispers, rumors, and warnings that traveled faster than any horse could. The town had grown quiet in the late afternoon lull, only the faint creak of the water tower and the distant lowing of cattle breaking the stillness. Then, a bell jingled, the sharp sound of the general store's door opening, and the townsfolk looked up, instinctively alert, as Sheriff Harlan emerged. His boots scuffed the wooden porch, and he shaded his eyes with one hand, scanning the horizon. Dust swirled around his legs in restless little spirals. The shadow of a lone rider appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette against the dying sun. Even from afar, those who knew the man could recognize him. Sam, Ironhand, McCall, rancher, enforcer, and trouble, depending on who you asked. Sam's horse trotted with a steady rhythm, boots tapping in the stirrups. His hat was pulled low, hiding most of his face, but not the lines that hinted at countless long days under the scorching sun, battling cattle, rustlers, and life itself. The townsfolk instinctively gave him a wide berth. Mothers clutched their children tighter, and shopkeepers paused mid-sweep of their wooden floors. The wind seemed to carry a subtle warning, rustling signs and hats atop heads, as if nature itself knew the tension that rode into town. "Your head, don't," the voice came from the crowd gathered outside the saloon. Old Mrs. Pettigrew, wrapped in a faded shawl, her hands trembling, let out the warning like a prayer or a curse. Don't you dare, Sam." Her words were nearly drowned by the stirring murmurs of onlookers, but they hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. Everyone knew that Mrs. Pettigrew rarely spoke out of turn. If she said a warning, there was reason behind it. Sam's spurred boots clinked against his stirrups as he slowed his horse near the center of the street. His dark eyes scanned the crowd without flinching. He had heard the whispers of townsfolk and warnings of neighbors before, and he always weighed them carefully, but his decision was already made. He was a man of action, and action had a way of leaving people outraged. A young boy, no more than 10, tugged nervously at his mother's skirt. "Mama, is he gonna?" "Shush," his mother hissed, her eyes scanning the street. "Stay quiet, don't look." But the boy's gaze remained fixed on Sam. He had heard stories. Every child in Dry Creek had. Tales of Ironhand McCall were told in whispers and warned about at bedtime. How he could ride all day under the blistering sun and not falter. How he could wrangle a wild steer with nothing but one hand and sheer force. How he could make the law itself bend if it interfered with his sense of justice. Cobb, the Barker rancher, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He was broad-shouldered, hot-headed, and easily angered, with a red face and fists clenched tightly at his sides. "Sam," he bellowed, voice cracking against the wind. "I told you last week. Leave the Barker ranch alone. You don't get to decide where we put our fence." His tone carried over the clattering of horses and the soft whine of the wind. Sam dismounted slowly, leather boots hitting the dusty ground with a quiet authority that somehow demanded attention. Every eye in the street followed him as he removed one glove, then the other, letting them hang at his sides. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone commanded the attention of everyone, from the young boys who peeked from behind barrels to the elderly men who shook their heads knowingly. "I'm not here for a fight," Sam said calmly, his voice carrying clearly, measured and even, like a steel blade wrapped in velvet. "I'm here to settle what's owed." Cobb's face darkened, veins bulging at his temples. "And what's that?" Sam's gaze didn't waver. "Your cattle have been trespassing. Destroying fences. Stealing feed. I warned you months ago. I'm done talking." The crowd murmured, a wave of tension rippling through them. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. Old men muttered curses under their breath, not because Sam was unjust, but because everyone knew the way he handled justice was personal, direct, and uncomfortable for anyone in the wrong. Women clutched their aprons, whispering to neighbors, exchanging worried glances. The town had seen disputes before, but nothing like this, not involving Sam McCall directly. Cobb took a step forward, his fingers twitching as if already reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "You can't. You have no right." "I have every right," Sam replied, his tone steady, calm as the desert at dawn. He lifted one hand, not in threat, but in a slow, deliberate motion. The crowd held its collective breath. Then, with the precision of a man who had spent his life honing every movement, Sam brought his hand down, not violently, but firmly, on Cobb's hat. The wide brim shot off his head, sailing through the air and landing with a thud several feet away. Dust puffed up around it. I said don't, Sam muttered, almost under his breath, though the words carried, and the weight behind them was unmistakable. Cobb froze, his face a perfect mask of shock, rage, and embarrassment. You, how dare you? My hat, his voice faltered. The crowd gasped, some recoiling as if the act had violated the very air of the street. The women whispered, horrified, while the men's faces twisted in disbelief. A few younger men clenched their fists instinctively, considering stepping forward, but then, wisely, they held back, remembering the stories of Ironhand McCall and the power that seemed to radiate from him. Sam stood over Cobb for a moment, his gaze cold and unyielding. I warned you. Consider that your first and only warning. Then he stepped back slowly, mounted his horse, and sat tall in the saddle. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as if every inch carried the weight of consequence. Dust swirled around him again as he nudged the horse forward, moving off the street with steady calm. The murmurs of the crowd erupted into voices, overlapping in chaos and indignation. You can't do that, one shouted. Right in front of everyone, yelled another. Shame on you, Sam McCall, came from the women at the edge of the crowd. Some men muttered quietly, that's the way he is. Always has been, always will be. Others shook their heads, disbelief etched deep into their weathered faces. But for all the outrage, a thread of unease ran through the crowd. Even those furious with him couldn't deny the power in his actions, the sheer inevitability of it. Cobb, still hatless and fuming, glared up at Sam's retreating figure. His hands trembled with anger, but he knew better than to follow. The lesson had been delivered in full view of the town. Sam McCall didn't need weapons. His reputation, his presence, his willingness to act, were enough. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town. Dust hung in the air, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, reflecting the tension and uncertainty. The townsfolk began to disperse slowly, some muttering in anger, some in awe. Conversations bubbled in clusters, voices low but urgent. Did you see that? I told you he was trouble. He had no right, none whatsoever. Yet beneath it all, a grudging respect lingered, like the scent of horses and leather after a long day in the saddle. Even after Sam disappeared over the ridge, the memory of the act lingered. Children whispered it to each other, mimicking the swing of his hand. Adults shook their heads, still fuming, still uneasy. And in the saloon, where a few men had gathered, chairs scraped back violently as they gestured and argued, the words echoing into the night. Ironhand McCall has gone too far, someone said. He can't keep doing this. He can't just take matters into his own hands. Outside, Mrs. Pettigrew clutched her shawl tighter, her lips moving silently in prayer. Your head, don't, she murmured again, as if saying it could somehow make a difference now. But the warning had already been ignored. Sam McCall had acted, and in his wake left anger, fear, and a town divided. And in the fading light, Sam rode on, unhurried, unafraid, leaving Dry Creek to process the shock, the humiliation, and the justice his way had delivered. The street was still, except for the whispers of the wind, the scattered dust, and the murmurs of a town whose peace had been shattered, one hat at a time. By the time the sun had disappeared completely behind the hills, Dry Creek had transformed into a town simmering with anger and unease. Shadows stretched across the main street like fingers, long and grasping, brushing the wooden facades of the saloon, the sheriff's office, and the general store. Windows glowed dimly with lantern light as the townsfolk gathered in hushed, urgent clusters. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint tang of horses, but beneath that was something heavier, something charged. The collective outrage of a town that had just witnessed a man take justice into his own hands. Inside the saloon, the clatter of chairs and mugs echoed as men and women jostled to talk over one another. The piano in the corner had gone silent hours ago, leaving only voices, angry, anxious, and incredulous. I can't believe he did that. Right in front of everyone. One man shouted, slamming a fist on the bar. It's unthinkable. A man doesn't just strike another man's hat off his head in the middle of the street. Another man, older, with a graying mustache and a lined face, shook his head slowly. I told you, he said quietly, voice low but firm, Sam McCall doesn't follow rules. He makes them. You either accept it, or you get out of the way. That's how he's always been. The first man spun around, anger flaring. Get out of the way. He humiliated Cobb, and all of us, right there in the dust. Did he think of anyone but himself? Meanwhile, the women of the town whispered in corners, clutching their shawls tightly. Some were afraid that the act had been an omen, a warning that the lawless ways of the Wild West were creeping closer to their homes. Others were furious at the arrogance, the display of power, and the lack of consideration for the community's norms. A man like that, one woman muttered, shaking her head, he'll bring nothing but trouble to our town if we don't stop him. Outside, the street seemed eerily quiet, but only for a moment. Small groups of men paced, hands on hips, muttering, plotting. Cobb stood among them, still hatless, his face flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation. We can't just let him get away with this, he hissed. He thinks he can ride into our town and do whatever he wants. Tomorrow, he'll have our fences torn down, our cattle stolen, and who knows what else. We need to show him he's not above everyone. Others nodded, some more cautiously than others. Easy there, one man warned. We're not rustlers or gunslingers. Sam McCall doesn't just let things slide. You try to confront him, and you'll get more than a hat slapped off your head. He'll make you wish you'd stayed in your bunk all day. But the anger didn't fade, it only simmered under the surface. The sheriff, Harlan, leaned against his office door, watching the rising tension with a weary frown. He had seen Sam's work before, and he knew firsthand how dangerous it was to underestimate the man. Yet he also knew the town couldn't be left in this state. They'll come for him, he muttered to himself, rubbing his chin. They always do when someone feels wronged. And when the whole town comes together, well, that's trouble no man can outrun. As night deepened, the lamplight flickered along the wooden streets, illuminating groups of townsfolk whispering and arguing in corners. Cobb gathered a small posse of like-minded men, their faces tight with determination. We need to confront him, Cobb said firmly. We can't just stand by while he treats us like fools. Sam McCall may be strong, but there are enough of us together to show him he isn't untouchable. Some men hesitated. Are you sure that's wise? One asked quietly, glancing at the darkened horizon. Sam isn't a man you confront lightly. He's not like anyone else in these parts. Cobb slammed a fist into his palm. I don't care. Enough is enough. That act, smacking my hat off in front of everyone, is an insult to the entire town. We'll ride to his ranch tomorrow and make him answer. He'll see that Dry Creek isn't afraid of him. Meanwhile, across town, other citizens debated in hushed tones over the saloon bar. Do you think he knew what he was doing? One asked, swirling whiskey in a chipped mug. He did. He always does. He wants them scared. That's what Sam McCall does. But how far will he go? Another whispered, eyes darting to the window. If the whole town marches to his ranch, he won't hesitate to use whatever's at hand. I've seen him take down wild bulls with his bare hands. A group of us, against him, we'd be fools. The conversations carried into the night, weaving a tapestry of fear, anger, and grudging respect. Stories were retold, exaggerated, and passed from person to person. Each telling made Sam seem larger, more formidable, more untouchable. But for all the awe, the simmering rage refused to die. By midnight, the town had quieted down to the tense hush of anticipation. Lamps flickered in the main street as a cold wind swept through, stirring dust and the scent of horse sweat. In the shadows, Cobb and his men made final plans, outlining the route to Sam's ranch and debating how to confront him. Voices were low, but determination was loud in their tone. Meanwhile, Sheriff Harlan made his rounds, walking the streets with careful steps. He saw the quiet anger in the faces of the townsfolk, the whispers in alleyways, and the hushed plotting. He shook his head, exhaling slowly. This isn't going to end quietly, he murmured. He understood Sam McCall's reasoning. Justice, his way, was direct and often necessary. But the fallout, the wrath of a whole town, was something even Sam couldn't completely control. At the Barker Ranch, Cobb paced outside, his hat still in his hands, a bitter reminder of the afternoon's humiliation. He glared at the horizon where Sam's ranch lay just beyond the hills. His fingers itched for action, but so did a gnawing uncertainty. "He's dangerous," Cobb muttered, mostly to himself. "More dangerous than any of us can imagine. But I can't let him walk away from this. Not after today." Across town, families whispered among themselves about what the next day might bring. Some feared open confrontation, some feared retaliation, and some feared that Sam's way of justice would escalate further. "He doesn't care who's watching," one mother said, holding her child close. "He does what he thinks is right. And what he thinks is right scares me." As the night stretched on, the wind howled through Dry Creek like a living thing, carrying with it the murmurs, the plotting, and the tension of a town on edge. Sam McCall, far beyond the horizon, was already asleep in his modest ranch house, unaware of how deeply the town's anger had taken root, yet fully aware that actions always had consequences. He knew some would ride to his door, some would demand answers, and some might seek to make him pay for his boldness. But he also knew that standing firm, delivering justice his way, sometimes meant facing the wrath of everyone else. By the early hours of dawn, the town had settled into a tense stillness. Dust swirled lazily across empty streets, broken occasionally by a dog barking or a horse shifting in its stall. But under the quiet, the anger and planning of the townsfolk lingered like a storm cloud waiting to break. Cobb and his small group of men had already begun their preparations, checking saddles, counting guns, and whispering plans that could lead to violence. Even the children felt it. From their beds, they could hear the murmurs drifting through cracked windows. The older ones whispered to each other about Sam McCall, about courage, fear, and recklessness. Stories of his past feats, some true, some exaggerated, loomed larger than the town itself. By the time the first light of dawn streaked the sky, the town of Dry Creek had been transformed not by Sam McCall himself, but by the ripples of his actions, leaving anger, tension, and anticipation heavy in the air. And in the quiet of his ranch, Sam McCall sipped black coffee and stared out across the hills, aware that the town's fury would not remain dormant for long. The street may have emptied, and the crowd dispersed, but Dry Creek had learned something important that day: that Sam McCall acted on his own terms, that warnings could be ignored at peril, and that even the mightiest of men must sometimes stand alone in the shadow of consequence. The town whispered his name as if speaking it aloud might summon him back. Ironhand McCall, Ironhand McCall, and the wind carried the sound across the hills. He had acted, delivered the warning, and left them furious, frightened, and powerless, at least for now. And that knowledge, as heavy as it was, filled him with a quiet certainty that the next storm would come, and he would be ready.